request everyone to settle down, please. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you all are refreshed after the break. We now have our final keynote speaker, Mr. Jayram Ramesh, Member of Parliament since 2004, representing both Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka. He is currently the chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on Science and Technology, Environment and Forests. Mr. Ramesh is also a founding member of the Indian School of Business. To give you a brief background, after completing his undergraduate degree from the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay, from where he recently won the Distinguished Alumni Award, he went to the US to study policy at Carnegie Mellon, following which he started his PhD program at MIT, where he studied technology, policy, economics, engineering, and management as part of a newly established interdisciplinary technology policy program. After numerous assignments with the World Bank, he then returned to India in 1979 to consult the government on economic issues. In 2011, Mr. Ramesh was appointed as the Union Council of Ministers of India as the Minister of Rural Development and the Minister of the new Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation. Between 2009 and 2011, he was Minister of State at the Ministry of Environment and Forests. Since then, Mr. Ramesh has helped in the design and implementation of special development strategies for 9 Maoist-affected states. He has also played a key role in the design of legislation such as the Right to Information Act, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, the Forest Rights Act, the National Food Security Act, as well as the Land Acquisition Act. Internationally, he has played a key leadership role in the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and climate change summits in Copenhagen and Cancun, where he was acknowledged by world leaders such as the US President Barack Obama and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. He has been lauded for bringing environmental, sustainable development, and forest conservation issues on the national agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our final keynote of ILS 2019, Mr. Jayram Ramesh. We also have a very popular face from the past 2 days, our moderator, Mr. Akshay Rathi, who will be moderating the discussion.
Good evening, everyone. If I may add to that very long introduction that has just been given for, so in my opinion, and in the little bit of time that I've known him, possibly one of the coolest guys in this auditorium, and essentially the coolest man in the Rajya Sabha. So the topic of the day, which is environmental ethics, I don't think there's been a time where it's been more relevant than it could be compared to today. Groundwater is expected to run out of Chennai in a year. Delhi and Kolkata suffer from terrible air quality, and the topography of Bombay is loaded with mounds of garbage. So what have we done wrong?
Well, it's not a question of environmental ethics, it's a question of environmental survival now for us. I think the thing that we have done wrong is we've taken economics textbooks very seriously, like most other countries have. And every country in the world has followed the traditional grow now, pay later model, that you have 20, 25 years of fast, rapid economic growth, worry about the consequences of economic growth, after you've reached a certain level of per capita income. This is what the Europeans did, this is what the Americans did, this is what the Brazilians did, and this is what the Chinese have done over the last 25 years. I think India also has been a late entrant into this club, but we are a determined entrant into this club, that we want to grow fast, we want to grow rapidly, we want to reach $5 trillion, we want to reach 10 trillion, depending on who's speaking at what forum. But nobody really is asking the question, what's the nature of this growth? What's the nature of this expansion that you're having? And I think India stands at a historic turning point where we can show to the world that this grow now, pay later model is no longer relevant. And that we need to protect our environment as part of the process of economic growth, not grow and reach a level of $10,000 per capita and then start worrying about the environment as other countries have. So I think the first thing that we need to do as Indians is to recognize the limitations of the grow now, pay later model and try to understand why India needs to be different. Why should India be different and why should India not follow the traditional growth model that economics teaches us? And I think there are a couple of reasons I just want to very quickly mention why India needs to be different. One, demographically, no country in the world is facing the pressure that India is facing. Today, we are 1.3 billion, and by the turn of the middle of the century, we would be 1.7 billion. In fact, by 2024, we would be the world's largest country, most populous country. So we are going to be adding a third of our current population in the next 25 to 30 years. There's no country in the world which has this type of demographic pressures. Most countries either have stagnant populations or they have declining populations, like in Europe and even China, for example. So the fact that demographically we are going to expand, continue expanding, and we are going to be a young population. Today our median age is 28. Even by the year 2040, our median age is going to be in the low 30s. So it's going to be a young population, it's going to be an increasing population, and therefore the notion of intergenerational equity, what you're bequeathing to future generations, becomes very relevant. The second reason why India needs to be different is climate change. I mean, this is no longer a nightmare scenario, it's a reality that we face on a day-to-day basis. The monsoon is becoming very unpredictable. The glaciers, the Himalayan glaciers are retreating. The mean sea levels along the 7,500 kilometer long coastline is increasing, and our forests are disappearing at a fairly alarming rate. So climate change is not a theoretical proposition, it's a day-to-day reality as far as India is concerned, and no country in the world has the multiple vulnerabilities that India has. Thirdly, public health. Environment now is actually having not in the short run mortality impacts, but it's having morbidity impacts. Water pollution, air pollution, chemical contamination is having morbidity impacts in state after state, in city after city. So environment is no longer a middle class elitist issue, it's an issue that is affecting the public health of ordinary people like you and me. And finally, unlike in the West, where environmental ethics becomes an issue of lifestyle, in India, by and large, across the country, environmental ethics is an issue of livelihoods. Environmental issues in India are issues of access to forests, access to water, access to land. So these are livelihood issues. These are not, some fancy lifestyle issues. So I think all in all, where we have gone wrong is not recognizing the peculiar situation that India is in, demographically, from a climate change point of view, from a public health point of view, from a livelihood point of view, and not trying to make a difference to the growth trajectory that other countries have done. So, we worship the god of GDP. Now, as Indians, we are comfortable with worshipping multiple gods and goddesses. That comes natural to us. So, in addition to worshipping this god of GDP, doing the Mangalarti of GDP in the morning after reading the Economic Times, in the evening you should really be worried about what is the cost of this high GDP. How is it affecting land? How is it affecting water? How is it affecting your mountains? How is it affecting your forests? How is it affecting your rivers? And I think that's the real challenge before us today. We have to get this thinking into our minds that environment doesn't mean slow economic growth. That in the long run, to be equitable, rapid growth has to be sustainable. If you don't have sustainable growth, it's not going to be equitable.
Right, so but economic growth is one thing. There's another thing called infrastructural growth, which is pretty critical for the 1.3 billion strong nation that we are. And very often, infrastructural growth can be seen at crossroads with, the cause of the environment. Just last week, you were at the RA colony in Bombay, where infrastructure and environment are at crossroads apparently. So how do you strike that balance in a country like ours, which needs to service the 1.3 billion strong population, where the infrastructure is not adequate as of now, while still protecting the environment?
Well, there is a conflict. To assume that environment and development are always in harmony with each other is being unrealistic. So there are choices you have to make. And you've given the example of the RA forest. There are many examples. You are having an example in this state of Telangana itself. In the last few days, you've seen the controversy over uranium mining in the Nelamala forest. You need uranium, you need to generate more power, but you also need to protect your forests, right? So these conflicts are there. These trade-offs have to be made. So it would be intellectually dishonest to say, no, we'll always, we can somehow marry environment and development. In theory, you need to do that. In practice, there will be cases where environmental objectives and growth objectives come in conflict with each other. And in such situations, through a democratic process, I stress the word, through a democratic process, you have to resolve these conflicts. Sometimes these conflicts will not satisfy the environmental community. Sometimes the resolution of these conflicts will not satisfy the growth community, the infrastructure community, the builder community, the mining community. But that's the nature of democratic societies, that you strike a compromise, you do a middle path. There is no textbook which gives you the magic formula. There is no magic formula. You have to always look at these situations, and you have to ask yourself the question, how do I reconcile the process of economic growth with environmental protection? Sometimes it means a sacrifice on the infrastructure front. Sometimes it may well involve saying, all right, I will allow a 6-lane highway, or I'll allow a hydropower project, but I will build adequate safeguards in such a manner that the environmental equilibrium is not disturbed. So I think this is an extraordinarily time-consuming process. It's also a process which cannot be decided technocratically or scientifically, because environment is a political issue. It's an issue that relates to people. It is an issue that relates to livelihoods of people. So therefore, I think what we need to do, the answer to your question is, yes, these conflicts are there. Yes, India needs infrastructure, but not infrastructure at the cost of forests, not infrastructure at the cost of polluted air. We cannot pollute our way to prosperity. We certainly cannot deforest our way to prosperity. So we have to, if you ask me, should India have 9% rate of growth and deforestation and pollution, or should it have 7% rate of growth with protecting the environment and forests? My hand will go up for the latter. I mean, it's as simple as that. But there are growth fanatics in our country, and there are also environmental fanatics in our country. You have to avoid the fanaticism of both sides and go the middle path.
Sure, sir. In the context of environment conservation, the role of creating awareness through education can be pretty critical.
Yes.
Do you think we are doing enough in that context? And if not, what do you think can we do to frame the right mindsets for this?
You know, it's very interesting you asked me this question. There is no species in the world which respects nature on paper as Indians. There is no culture in the world which teaches you to respect nature as Indian culture. It's a paradox of India that we entire Western civilization, of which ISB is a good example, the entire Western civilization is based on man's conquest of nature. Indian civilization has always been based on man living in harmony with nature. We worship gods of nature. We worship nature as a goddess. We worship, all our most popular gods are riding tigers, riding lions, riding, one of our most popular god has an elephant, Vakratundam, Lord Ganesha. We worship nature in its multiple forms. We worship our rivers. We worship our mountains. But it's amazing that this culture, which no other culture in the world respects nature the way we do, no other culture ignores nature the way we do. So something has happened to us. Something has happened to us. We grow up respecting nature. We grow up respecting gods, goddesses, nature in its various forms. But when it comes to our actions, we are not willing to put our money where our mouth is. So I have always believed you don't need to educate an Indian about nature protection. Nature protection comes naturally to Indians. The Ministry of Environment and Forests, the new building in Delhi, as soon as you enter the building, you will find written on the building, Prakriti Rakshati Rakshataha. This was said 4,000 years ago. Prakriti Rakshati Rakshataha. Nature protects those who protect it. It's a wonderful saying. I can't find a similar saying in any other civilization. However, if you ask me, am I protecting nature? Are you protecting nature? Are you protecting nature? I would be hard put to give you a positive response. So we should realize that we are the legatees of a civilization that teaches people to live in harmony with nature. Once we start that, then I think we will begin to start protecting nature. Why do we throw plastic bags into the Ganga? When you go to Varanasi, why do you throw all your muck into the Ganga, which is supposed to be the most venerated, holy river for all of us? So this does not need education. This needs a certain degree of understanding where you're from. And I think people today are more environmentally conscious than they were 50 years ago. I think your generation certainly is much more conscious of it than my generation is. And today you find a lot more environmental activism. You might find a lot more young men and women. By the way, I must tell you a very interesting thing about environment in India. All the great environmental movements in India have been led by women. Whether it is the 300 years ago, the Bishnoi community. You come from Rajasthan, you know the Bishnois. The Bishnoi community, the Khejri, the local Maharaja, ordered the destruction of the Khejri tree, and the women of the community protected the Khejri tree. In the 1970s, some of you may be aware, in the Himalayas we had a movement called the Chipko movement. And the Chipko movement was literally Chipko. They were literally Chipkoing the trees in Uttarakhand. And who was doing the Chipkoing? It's the women of Uttarakhand. In Narmada, who has been the great activist of the Narmada campaign? Is Medha Patkar, and a whole set of women activists. So we have in India over the last, I would say, 30, 40 years, a growing sense of awareness. People are becoming aware. The trouble is, people are aware, but governments are insensitive. This is the paradox. Because governments want 6-lane highways, big power projects, big dams, big mines, whereas people want, protecting the environment. So you have to bridge this gap, and I'm a firm believer that pressure from the people will force governments, whichever the political parties they belong to, will force governments to be far more sensitive to environmental issues than they otherwise would be. And this is what happened in the Chipko movement. It's happened to a large extent in the Narmada, although the Narmada project was allowed to continue. And there have been other such instances in the Niyamgiri episode in Odisha, where the bauxite mining, many such examples where pressures from local communities have forced governments to be environmentally more conscious and environmentally more ethical. I think you need to educate not people, you need to educate governments. That's the real challenge before us.
Right. So just about a week ago, you took over as the chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee for Environment in Forests. At the level of policy, what do you think are the changes that need to come into play in India? Of course, this is the role of the government, which you said needs to be better educated about this. What do you think needs to happen at that level?
There's only one thing that we need to do seriously. India has the most progressive laws for protecting the environment. We have the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. We have the Water Pollution Control Act of 1974. We have the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. We have the Air Pollution Control Act of 81. And we have the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. And then, of course, we have the Forest Rights Act of 2006. India's laws and legislation is perhaps amongst the most progressive in the world. But you know, we take great delight in passing laws and greater delight in bypassing them, you know. So enforcement of laws is what really matters. If you enforce the law, the Ganga would not be as dirty as it is today. If you enforce the law, cities like Hyderabad would not be as polluted as they are. If you enforce the law, the wetlands would have been protected in city after city. So my campaign as minister, as chairman now, is just to keep hammering at this message of enforcement. Without fear, without favor. Enforce your laws, enforce your laws. Why is it that an Indian will treat laws so cavalierly in India, but go to Singapore and follow the same law? The enforcement culture in Singapore is different than the enforcement culture here. You know, chalta hai, ho jayega, wo janta hu officer ko, he'll be managed. You know, these are the types of approaches we have to enforcement of laws. So environment doesn't require new laws. It doesn't require new standards. It does not require new regulations. It does not require new institutions. They are there. You have to enforce them. And that requires political will, it requires political courage, and it requires political leadership, actually. Ultimately, we're talking of a leadership summit. You know, it requires political leadership.
Sure, sir. And as the old saying goes, charity must begin at home. What do you think we as common citizens can do to contribute to the cause of environment protection? Day-to-day habits, basics.
First, use public transport. Your carbon footprint automatically comes down dramatically. If you are in a position to use public transport, use public transport. If you are in a position not to use air conditioners, do not use air conditioners. If you are in a position to use green electricity, use green electricity. I mean solar rooftops and so on. So there are a host of things that individuals do which add up to a national response. Although ultimately I agree the responsibility is that of the government because they have to enforce the laws. But individual behavior very important, and I've given you some examples of public transport, the way you use lighting, the way you design your buildings, the way you use electricity. These are all very, very carbon intensive, emission intensive activities, and I think there's much to learn from Gandhi in this regard. I mean, you know, the patron saint of environmentalism all over the world is Gandhi. The whole world venerates Gandhi as Saint Gandhi for environmentalism. So we don't have to go very far. We just have to see what Gandhi, the way Gandhi used to recycle paper, for example, the use of recycling paper, the use of recycled waste material. These are, you know, we mistake this for austerity. These are not austerity. This is a work ethic. This is having a consumption As Gandhi very famously once said, there is enough in the world for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed, right? So I think our consumption patterns also need to undergo a dramatic shift. Those of you, when I was environment minister in 2009, somebody asked me, what are Indians in the US? Somebody asked me, what is India doing to reduce emissions? So I said, well, before you ask what India is doing to reduce emissions, I would like you to ask what America is doing to reduce emissions. So he asked me, what should America do to reduce emissions? So I said, first thing you should do is stop eating beef. Because the biggest contributor to methane emissions is the cattle population. And I'm not saying beef out of any religious or any great cultural thing. People believe in that. That's their belief. But from a climate point of view, a non-vegetarian diet, particularly a beef-oriented diet, adds to the environmental burden. So that's another thing that I don't know whether beef curry or beef cutlets are sold here, are served here, but the manner in which we consume food is also a very important determinant of what happens to the environment.
So those have been absolutely incredible insights. We'll open the house for
Sure.
the audience to ask them questions. Can we do this with raise of hands, and I'll just let a few people? And can we have a mic going out? Sure. We'll start with the gentleman right here.
Good evening, sir. My name is Ilyas. First of all, it's a great honor. And my question is, if you were to be the Prime Minister of our country, what were the main factors on which you would focus on?
There's no vacancy right now. Sorry? It may come in the future. Well, till 2024 at least, 2020. See, the political process is important. I think the question is not, whether I become Prime Minister or not. And I kept saying the fact that democratic processes should determine how decisions get taken in relation to the environment, because conflicts are involved. There are gainers and there are losers. And we are not a command and control society. We are not a Stalinist society. We are a democratic society. And this has to be through a consultative process. And that's why, for example, one of the key features of environmental approval in our country has been the system of public hearings. We have public hearings before mines are opened, before railway projects are implemented, before roads are built. The trouble is, unfortunately, we treat these public hearings, where there is public, there is no hearing, and where there is a hearing, there is no public. So, for example, I discovered there were some coal mines that were to be opened, the Singareni collieries, and they were having public hearings in an area which was not affected by the opening of the coal mine. The point I wish to make is that this is an intensely public process. It's an intensely participative and consultative process. It's not something that you can issue a fatwa and say, okay, this is how environment is going to be protected. That's not the way I think our society is structured. That's not the way decisions will get taken. But people have to be heard. And compromises have to be struck because of the fact that he raised. Because you need roads, you need mines, you need power projects, you need dams, you need development to create jobs. On the other side, you also need to worry about the human and the ecological consequences of what we are doing. So I think it's I would lay stress not on whether a Prime Minister can make a difference or not, but whether the democratic process is sensitive to the nuances of environmental decision making.
Fantastic. Yes, can we take the mic there at the back?
I actually had a
Oh,
question.
sure. We'll come next.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Good evening, sir. Firstly, thank you so much for coming here. My question is more from a global scale aspect. Given the Amazon forest fires and how they've been going on for so long, you talked about enforcement. There are resources from all across the world. There is awareness on a global scale. What is the issue there with enforcement, and if such fires which are uncontrollable and the world is not looking at it, going forward, how should we look at it as an entire community as to if such sort of issues happen, if nobody is paying attention, then who will, and how will it ever
What's the
come?
question? Sorry, enforcement?
The Amazon forest fires, nobody is taking action, nobody is doing anything. There are resources, there is awareness. But how do
Like
we...
India, the Amazon rainforest fire that's happening, there are better resources in Southern America to take care of it. But why is it not happening, and why is the fire not being stopped as effectively as it should be? That's the question.
Well, that's a toughie. A threat to environment anywhere is a threat to environment everywhere. So a fire in the Amazon is not a Brazilian concern. A fire in the Amazon is something that is of concern to the world, the ecosystem, the Great Barrier Reef, for example, in Australia. The Sundarbans in India. These are not, unfortunately, our geographies are political. But ecosystems follow no geographies. Ecosystems transcend geographies. So it's very difficult to have trans-border concerns. So in other words, the Brazilian president says, the fire in the Amazon is my lookout. I'm going to deal with it the way I want to deal with it. You have nothing to deal with it. This is the debate that's taken place in the last few years. We have a similar issue on pollution, cross-border pollution between India and Pakistan, or the Sundarbans issue between India and Bangladesh. So increasingly, environmental issues are becoming trans-border issues. It's not something that we can say arises within a particular geography and is confined to a particular geography. So environment is a global, that's why you need, environment is considered a global commons. So you require very often, like for example the ozone layer, it required a global solution. Climate change, even if India were to stop all its emissions, global warming is not going to stop because there are others who are contributing to global warming. So in other words, the protocols for managing the environment of course have to be national, but in many instances they become either regional or they become global. And that's very difficult. It's taken 25 years to negotiate a climate change accord, and we still don't have a climate change accord. But we have a very successful accord for controlling the ozone layer. In fact, the ozone depletion has stopped as a result of that Montreal Protocol. So there are some successful examples, but people see ecosystems as symbols of sovereignty. The Brazilian president sees Amazon as a symbol of Brazilian sovereignty, over which nobody else should have any worry. So if fires are taking place in the Amazon, it's my headache, I'm going to concern. This is it's a difficult question to answer, because all our institutions are anchored in the nation state. We don't have international organizations which are dealing with these issues at an international level, and people are not willing to give up sovereignty. You see this drama that's taking place in England. This whole Brexit drama is what? It's the fear of the Britishers that they have abandoned or transferred sovereignty to the Europeans. So that's why even India, for example, is not comfortable with a global agreement. India is comfortable with national commitments which it announces globally, but is not comfortable with a global agreement.
Good evening, sir. You talked about how the economic growth and our environment is linked, and you also rightly talked about how population is linked with the environment. So a few months ago, I was in conversation with Mr. Dominic, the British High Commissioner to India, and I raised the concern about this population to him, and he said that as the economies develop and grow, they develop a sense and perspective, and this growth helps in curbing the population. This becomes a vicious cycle that development, this population and environment are linked and come at a cost with each other. So now to promote development without affecting this environment, I think we need to have a better synergy across countries where we can share technology and green technologies and all, so that we kind of evolve as a community together. So do you think these trade restrictions and everything are also affecting our pursuit of curbing the damage to environment and all?
Well, let me disabuse you of one notion. Most of us think that population is responsible for environmental degradation. This is completely wrong. Between the year 1992 and the year 2015, the population of China declined, but the emissions of China went up manifold. They accounted for something like 6% of world emissions in 1992. By the year 2015, they accounted for 25% of world emissions at a time when population declined. It's not population that causes environmental degradation, it's consumption. You can have, what is the nature of consumption? In fact, if those of you who are interested, there's a very good book by Ramchandra Guha, who wrote many years ago. The title of the book is called How Much Do We Consume? Long before Ram Guha started writing about Indian history, he used to write about environment. And this was a very good book. And he made this point, one of the earliest to make this point, that it's not population per se that is the villain of the piece, it's consumption. What do we consume? How much do we consume? Why do we consume? The consumption is the key. So if you have an energy intensive, resource intensive, water intensive mode of consumption, obviously you're going to have environmental degradation. So it's not this automatic notion that population is increasing, therefore our environmental problems are getting serious. That's only partially true. It's not entirely true, as I pointed out by the Chinese example. Of course, I think technology sharing is very important. Technology plays a very important role. 15 years ago, in 2009, when I became a minister, solar prices was almost 15 rupees a unit. Today, solar prices are at 2 rupees 50 paise a unit. And solar rooftop is becoming an economic proposition. I don't know whether you have solar panels in the ISB campus, but I'm sure you do. This was unheard of economically even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So technology plays a very, very crucial role. It plays a crucial role in energy generation. It will play a crucial role in the way you started off with water, the use of water, the conservation of water, for example. And I think harnessing of green technologies is certainly a frontier that India can certainly be a world leader. And one advantage that we have is we are a latecomer, and therefore we can leapfrog. We don't have the large investments in traditional infrastructure. We can leapfrog to green infrastructure.
Right, we have time for one last question. Can we take it from somebody on this side? Yes, the lady in yellow there.
Hello.
Okay, sure. We'll take that then.
Why don't you take this lady as well? We'll take two more questions.
We'll take two, right.
Hello. Hi, good evening, sir. So if we look at the international response to climate change, as you talked about, culminating most recently with the Paris Agreement of 2015. So all these agreements have come in place after a lot of discussions, but we see that the countries, most notably the developed world, actually back out of their commitments. And they walk away from the negotiating table. So can a global climate agreement actually hold true when the most polluting countries who have common but differentiated responsibilities, so basically they actually led the pollution through the Industrial Revolution, if they only walk away, can such agreements hold true?
Well, it's certainly true that the developed countries are reneging on their commitments, and the most egregious example of this is the United States, which has actually walked out of the Paris Agreement. But my position has always been that India must speak from a position of strength. that we need to demonstrate to our own people our commitment to dealing with climate change, not because of some international agreement, but because it is in our own interest to do so. Because our monsoons are being uncertain, the examples that I gave, the glaciers, the sea levels, the forests and the monsoons. So we should speak from a position of strength. Unfortunately, what has happened in India for 25, 30 years, the discourse has been very defensive. We are telling the world, till you do something, we won't do anything. And why? Because we have in our pocket the Brahmastra. What is the Brahmastra? Our denominator. Our denominator is our biggest and most powerful Brahmastra. Because whatever we do, when we say per capita, you divide by 1.3 billion. And that 1.3 billion is increasing by 10 million every year. So everything in the world, per capita, India is at the bottom. Per capita income is bottom, per capita water consumption is the bottom, per capita Indra Nui says per capita soft drinks consumption is at the bottom. Per capita emissions, we are at the bottom. Obviously, 1.3 billion is a denominator and it's increasing. Most denominators are decreasing, right? So this per capita thing has been our biggest calling card internationally. And that has meant that we have postponed taking action. See, we should take action not because the Americans are taking it or the Europeans are telling us. We should take action because it's in our interest to do so. If we do this, then we are able to demand other countries to come on board. Today we are not in a position. So the Chinese are very smart at this. They have one position internationally where they abuse the Americans and the Europeans right, left and center. But domestically, they become world. Today they are the world leaders in wind energy, they are the world leaders in solar energy, they are the world leaders in pollution control. Beijing used to be once upon a time worse than Delhi. But today you see Beijing and you see Delhi, where they are, what the difference is. So we should take international agreements seriously. We should put everybody on the mat, but we should not use that as an argument for postponing our own actions. That's the point I wish to make, that we should show by leadership because it is in our interest to do so.
Good evening, sir. My name is Anusha and I'm an alum of ISB. So I've been working in the power sector for a couple of years now. I guess the biggest problem in the power sector, both renewable and the conventional one as such, has been this water, food and energy nexus. So the more food we consume, the more water we need to grow those crops, and the more water we need more power. So it's affecting the energy sector, by a huge margin. So what is your solution on breaking this water, food, energy nexus?
Well, sure. I mean, there is an intimate link between the crisis that we are facing in the water sector and in the power sector, no doubt about it. But that's largely true of fossil fuels, And I think as India makes the transition from a fossil fuel fired power strategy to one in which green energy, non-fossil fuels, like for example in the Paris Agreement we are committed that by the year 2030, 40% of our electricity will come from non-fossil fuels. Hopefully, it will be much more with technological advance, particularly if there is a huge advance in energy storage, which will really be the key as far as the power sector is concerned. So, recycling of water is something that we have to enforce on our power plants. Our power plants have traditionally been water guzzlers, particularly our coal-based plants have been water guzzlers. Our nuclear power plants are not so much water guzzlers because they recycle the water and they desalinate. They are based on, if you're based on the coast, then this problem is mitigated because you're desalinating the water, which is what is happening, say, for example, in Chennai. But by and large, yes, in the mainland of India, central India, eastern India, water is an issue. But that, we need the power, right? We need electricity. Our per capita consumption, again, very, very low. We need more power for household, for agriculture. Pricing of electricity is very important. If you're going to give power free, then water is going to be overconsumed. So in state after state, water, I have to say, my own party in this state, in this undivided state, promised free electricity. I had opposed it in 2004, but we promised and we won a handsome electoral victory in 2004, and therefore we believe that free power. But what does free power do? Free power does actually lead to higher extraction of water, particularly in the agricultural sector. So you have at least 7 states of India, 7 or 8 states of India, where pricing of power becomes very crucial. Pricing of water becomes very crucial. So price mechanism we have not really used. In fact, in the power sector, we have abused the pricing mechanism, and hopefully with the type of water crisis that we are confronting, I think state governments are beginning to realize that you need to have a little more rational approach to the pricing of water and pricing of power.
Thank you so
sir.
much.
Thank you, sir. Like every conversation and interaction we've had, this one's allowed me to inherit a wealth of knowledge, and I'm sure everyone here shares the sentiment. Thank you so much.
Can I ask the audience one question?
Absolutely, sir.
Okay, let me do a very quick straw poll. You're presented with a choice, and the choice is the following: that India will grow at 8% per year. But that 8% per year is going to extract an environmental cost. It will mean some forests being destroyed. It will mean some people being relocated. It will mean some submergence of land. So that's one choice. And you have another choice: India growing at 6.5%, 7%, but little more moderate economic growth. But there is a guarantee that these environmental costs are not going to be as heavy as in the former case. How many of you would choose the first alternative? How many would you choose 8% accompanied by environmental damage, which has to be managed? And how many of you would choose 6.5% with minimum environmental damage?
With all honesty,
Let's see, how many of you, you're not on, this is not going to be reported anywhere, so you can be, you can be honest. I just want to get a sense of what the thinking is. So how many of you for the 8%? Such a small minority in the Indian School of Business. How many of you are 6.5%ers? Majority. That's the answer.
we certainly have a bright future.
Very good.
Thank you so much for these lovely insights, sir, and thank you so much for being a part of the Leadership Summit.
Thank you.
Absolutely a pleasure having you here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ramesh. I think we all can agree that caring about the environment does not mean slow economic growth, but it means sustainable economic growth. On this note, I would like to call upon the GSP President, Shreyas Katta, to please present a memento on behalf of ISB.